All right, guys, I just want to compare the Sony to the Viltrox, so let's just get right into it. You're looking at the Sony 16mm right now. The front of the lens is right here. So the front of the lens is about 1 foot away, 12 inches away approximately. And you just hold still. Quick flare test while I'm here. This is at f1.8, by the way. So as you can see, they're vastly different physically in size, weight, and so forth. So let's go over some numbers really quick. The Sony is going for $799 US, and the Viltrox comes in at $580 US. So they're both f1.8 to f22. The Sony weighs 10.7 ounces or 304 grams versus the Viltrox, which is almost double at 19.4 ounces or 550 grams. So again, about half the weight. Both have 15 elements in 12 groups. The Sony has an 11-blade circular aperture. The Viltrox has a 9-blade. So the Sony has a 67mm filter thread, and the Viltrox has a 77mm filter thread. All right, so as far as minimum focus distance goes, the Sony is far superior. It's got a 5.9-inch minimum focus distance, or 15 centimeters, which will yield you a 0.25x magnification. The Viltrox is 10.6 inches, or 27 centimeters, and that will only yield you 0.1x magnification. You can get a little bit closer in manual focus mode as well, just so you know. So as far as autofocus motors go, the Sony has 2 XD linear focus motors, which is like the best you can get in, this current market these days. The Viltrox has 1 noiseless STM focus motor, which works pretty darn good. The key difference here is the Sony will be able to keep up with super high speed moving subjects in both photos and videos. So think like skateboarding, BMX, snowboarding, stuff like that, like at close range, like going off jumps and stuff. Sony's gonna definitely work better in those types of situations. So both these lenses have manual aperture rings with the D-click and click feature, as you can see here. But the Sony actually has the iris lock feature, which I really like. You can see it right here. Iris lock, so you can lock that like so. So now it's locked in auto and it won't go anywhere. You can't do that on the Viltrox, so when you mount the lens, a lot of times I end up turning the aperture ring like that, which it's one of those things that just drives me crazy. So if you have a manual aperture ring on a lens, in my opinion, if you're a lens manufacturer, you absolutely should put a lock on there. Now they both have the autofocus manual focus switch on them, as you can see. However, the Viltrox actually has 2 function buttons here. It's got FN1 and FN2. The Sony only has the 1 function button. The Viltrox also has this pretty cool LCD screen, which will give you information such as focus distance, aperture, or the function buttons, whatever you're doing with those. All right, so the focus ring on both of these lenses feels excellent. The Viltrox is a little bit larger, and it has a little bit more resistance, but they both have the same like smoothness to it. The Sony, again, is a little bit easier to turn, but it feels very smooth, just like the Viltrox. The Sony actually offers focus breathing support, which is really nice. And that's like a more pro-oriented feature, and you only get that with native Sony lenses. Not even all Sony lenses, but this one has it. And you can see with the Viltrox, the breathing compensation is grayed out. Here you can see the breathing comp. So you can turn that on the Sony lens, and that will crop in just a little bit. All right, this is the Sony 16mm with focus breathing compensation off. Just gonna switch to the background and back to my clamp here. All right, so now I have focus breathing compensation on. You should be able to see how much it cropped in. It's only a little bit. But now, when I go from the clamp to the background, you should see none of that zooming. Like that zooming effect on the edges. This is the Viltrox. Looks like it has very little. So both lenses are dust and moisture resistant. They both have like a nice rubber gasket on the back. The Viltrox is like a red color, and the Viltrox also has the USB-C here, by the way, for firmware updates. And you can see here on the back of the Sony, we got the nice rubber gasket as well. It's just a black one on this. All right, guys, so straight off the bat here, I just wanted to show you the sharpness difference at f1.8. Now, on the left-hand side, if I drag down, you can see the EXIF data, the Sony here on the left, and the Viltrox is on the right. Now, these shots were taken from the exact same position, so that's the difference. So it looks like the Sony is actually a little bit wider than the Viltrox, even though this Sony on the left was actually corrected for the distortion. So I had brought it into the imaging edge and turned it into a TIFF file because Lightroom does not have the distortion profile yet for the new Sony lens. This is what the Sony lens looks like without the distortion correction. So if you're shooting raw like I was, this is what it looks like when it comes into Lightroom. Now when you open it up in the imaging edge, it automatically corrects. If I go here to the viewer, you could see when you import it into the imaging edge Sony software, it automatically corrects the distortion, so you don't even see it. But in Lightroom, you do see it. So I just wanted to show you guys that. And eventually Lightroom will have the profile correction. So it's kind of like a non-issue, especially if you're shooting JPEG. The issue becomes if you were to adapt a Sony lens to a Nikon camera with that like Megadap adapter that I reviewed a couple months ago. It's an awesome adapter for those Nikon users out there because you could use all the Sony lenses. However, you're not going to get the distortion correction. That's kind of a big deal. That's really the only case though that it kind of really matters, other than you can see the distortion here. When you're recording video, you don't see it. The camera automatically corrects for it. And if you shoot JPEG, the camera automatically corrects for it. Let me just zoom in here so you can see the corner sharpness difference. And looking at this little security camera, you can see they look very similar. It's really hard to tell the difference at 200% here. When we get up to the brick here, it does look like the Sony is quite a bit sharper though. And then of course, if we go to the center area, you can see the Sony is clearly sharper, it looks like to me, on the brick. And like the texture here, you could see the texture better. The colors are slightly different as well on the Sony versus the Viltrox, as you can see. All right, guys, so looking at the lab scene here very quickly, just this one shot here to compare the two lenses. You could see on the dollar bill that the Sony is noticeably more like punchy. It doesn't look as washed out. It seems to have better micro contrast and overall sharpness, I would say. It is pretty noticeable here. You can see it right here on this like barcode on the circuit board. You could see it on the little circuit board, like little, and then if you look at the pipe cleaners, you can definitely see the difference on the pipe cleaners and the paper of the crayon. It's very clear to me that the Sony has the edge in this test. All right, guys, so here is a real-world HDR. So I actually combined 3 exposures to make this shot, because when you make HDRs, any flaws that the camera might have get like exaggerated because you're combining 3 images. So the flaws kind of like multiply sort of thing with each frame. So you can see here, the Sony fares a lot better in this particular scenario shooting into the sun. The Viltrox at this specific angle happened to have this lens flare here, which you can see on the bottom. And the Sony also has it, but it's a lot harder to see the Sony. It's barely visible. And again, like I said, the HDR. As far as the colors go, you can see the colors are also different. The Sony looks a little bit warmer. All right, so here's one more. Now we're looking at the Sony versus the Viltrox. And again, these are the exact same shots. The camera was on a tripod, same spot. And you can see they both look very similar. You can see my shadow here. I was at f16 for these shots. So a lot going on here. They look very similar. Again, it's hard to tell the difference between these two lenses in this type of test. So in my opinion, I think it's worth the extra $220 for the Sony lens in this case, because it's about half the weight. It's much smaller in size, making it a way better option for gimbal work. It's going to be easier to balance. It's not going to be so front heavy and awkward. In addition, the smaller filter size will allow you to get much more affordable ND filters, polarizer filters, and things like that. The other thing that I really like about the Sony lens that the Viltrox does not have is the aperture iris lock right here. So I really like that one feature in particular as well. One other feature that the Sony offers that the Viltrox does not is the focus breathing. That doesn't really matter that much to me. I don't really care too much about focus breathing personally, but that is another nice feature. And for those that need that, that matters. If you're at the minimum focus distance and you're doing a rack to like infinity to minimum, that's where you will definitely notice the focus breathing. It's a huge difference in that regard. Although even with it off on the Sony lens, it's very well controlled. And lastly, the far superior autofocus system on the Sony, as far as high-speed subjects go, is not even comparable. So if you're somebody that's doing that type of stuff, that really matters. All right, guys, that about wraps up this quick comparison between the Sony and the Viltrox 16mm. I really hope you got what you were looking for. If you have any questions, please be sure to ask in the comments below. Also, guys, in the description area, I'll have links to all this gear and stuff. They're affiliate links, so I really appreciate the support. Lastly, if you can give me a thumbs up and consider hitting that subscribe button if you're not already subscribed, that would be super cool. So I'll catch up with you guys next time. All right, take care.